Just ahead, there's another edition of the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
I'm political analyst Al Spry, and it's great to be with you, Reagan. We're talking Common Core today.
Yes, Laura Caruso, who is rather expert in the field. Lots of confusion about educational standards in the state of Florida these days, and motions to change this way or that way.
Wait a minute, there's educational standards in Florida?
I know sometimes it doesn't seem like it, but that we're going to explore that. So stay put. The Florida Roundtable begins following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area of Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm political analyst and raconteur Al Spry. It's great to be here, Reagan, with you.
Always a pleasure to be with you, sir.
And it's also great to see you folks here on Tough TV 38. Why?
Absolutely.
They love us so much over at Tough TV 38. They're putting us on three days a week.
Well,
Wednesdays at 9 a.m., Saturdays at 9 a.m., and Sundays at 9 a.m.
That's an awful lot of trust.
It is. We have them completely fooled. And so you can watch us on Tough TV. Florida Roundtable is available, of course. You can receive us over the air with an antenna. It's HD quality. It's beautiful. Also available in select apartment complexes, mobile home parks in Central Florida. Tough TV is also carried on the wonderful Summit Broadband Cable TV system, Channel 69. And if you can't receive our Tough TV programming on your local cable or satellite operator, or national cable or satellite operator, please call them and say, I want my Tough TV.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, Reagan, we are going to have on, of course, Laura Caruso is going to talk about Common Core, another push from big government to teach your kids exactly what they want your kids to learn.
Big Brother is watching.
Big Brother is watching. He's laying back.
Hand. He's got his hand in your pocket.
He's got a cigar in one hand. He's drinking a beautiful scotch, and he knows that he's got you by the you-know-whats.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, of course, who's in cahoots? Big corporations.
Yeah.
For those who think that the two are mutually exclusive, big corporations and big government. Boy, they're more and more looking and sounding like the same. So we have that thing that we'll talk about in a little bit. For right now, let's talk about...
Well, I tell you what, let me do this. I wanted to mention the passing of a gentleman.
Yes.
Was the governor of the state of Florida when I arrived here, and the first governor that I met in person. I was privileged to know Claude Kirk, the late Claude Kirk, the first Republican governor of Florida since the end of the Civil War, but that was after his governorship had ended. Reuben Askew passed away here recently, and Reuben Askew was the governor of Florida from 1971 to 1979. A true gentleman. In more recent years, he had been teaching at Florida State University. I had the privilege of emceeing a panel of former governors here at the University of Central Florida a couple of years ago, and he was just the Southern politician, Southern gentleman. He led this state through some very turbulent times in the country. These were the years of the Vietnam unrest. There was a recession. We had the gas shortages. Watergate, a presidential resignation. And under Reuben Askew, Florida continued to prosper. And he was the first politician from Florida to put his name forward in a presidential primary. He did, in 1980, attempt in Iowa and New Hampshire. He entered his name in the Democratic sweepstakes for president, and he didn't really do very well. And I think after the second or third primary, he dropped out. But nevertheless, he was the first one to make an attempt to go and play on the national stage.
Reuben Askew, R.I.P. Of course, Claude Kirk died recently, too.
Yes,
so we're losing governors like nobody's business
yeah.
here.
Wow.
Former Representative Connie Mack joined a lobbying firm. It's like all politicians join lobbying firms. It's funny how that works.
Yeah.
After he unsuccessfully challenged Senator Bill Nelson. But under rules, he was barred from actual lobbying when he first joined the firm last year. But now he could take on the lobbying title, and he is working on behalf of American Task Force Argentina. He's pursued the South American country, the task force since its 2001 debt default, seeking repayment of billions owed to the U.S. investors. So there you go.
No truth to the rumor that he's using "Don't Cry for Me, Argentina" as a theme song? Does he know Eva Perón?
I'd like to see him belt that out. That would be fun.
There you go. All right, you're listening to the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
You're going to have me singing soon, Reagan. I'm Al Spry.
We better get to a commercial break. The Florida Roundtable continues following these messages. We're back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And Al, as promised, we are off to the Tallahassee area, where we are joined today by Laura Caruso. She is an activist in the Common Core movement. We've heard an awful lot about Common Core and FCAT and changing the examinations of our students in the public school system. Laura, welcome to the Florida Roundtable.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Now, before we get started, instead of Al and I sitting here and reading your credentials and whatnot, how about if you go ahead and take the first minute and tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and how it is you came to be involved in Common Core?
Certainly. Again, my name is Laura Caruso, and I actually hail from St. Cloud, Florida, just south of Orlando, but I'm up here in Tallahassee today to work with the Florida Family Policy Council and work with families and individuals who are doing grassroots lobbying of their legislators. And one of the issues that we're addressing is Common Core. My background is I have experience in public relations. That's my training and my professional background. But we homeschooled for many years, and I co-directed a homeschooling co-op in the St. Cloud area also for many years. And today, I provide educational services for home educating families and lead Christian history tours in Washington, D.C., Williamsburg, St. Augustine, and places like that.
Well, I'd like to kick things off. Of course, Jeb Bush, prominent Republican for many years, member of the famed Bush clan of presidents and senators, is for Common Core. Of course, there are many conservatives who are against Common Core. There's some moderates and liberals against Common Core as well. First off, let's discuss what exactly is Common Core and how is it developed and who developed it, and what does it mean for Florida students?
Absolutely, and it's such an important thing for people to really understand the basics of Common Core. We're hearing the term tossed around quite a lot. I would say this, something is very wrong in the state of Florida when the most dramatic shift in education policy in our lifetimes has been developed, has been adopted, and is 2.5 years into implementation, and polls show us that 40% of the population still doesn't know what it is. So that immediately should send up red flags.
Sure.
This came in kind of stealthily, and it was developed by two Washington, D.C.-based organizations, the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers. They're the ones that actually hold the copyright to the standards. And to kind of give folks appropriate terminology, standards are different than the tests, which are different than the curriculum. Those are the three main components of education policy. Standards, the tests that then measure how well we're accomplishing the standards, and the curriculum, meaning the lesson plans, the worksheets, the textbooks, those kind of things that are used to accomplish the standards and prepare students for the tests. Again, these standards, there's been a movement towards nationalized standards for some time, but back in 2007, the Gates Foundation provided a large grant to these two private Washington, D.C.-based organizations, the National Governors Association and the CCSSO.
That CCSSO is also known as Achieve, right? Is that it, the nonprofit? I have that information as well.
It can get confusing with all the various organizations.
Yeah.
My understanding is those two, the NGA and the CCSSO, actually kind of birthed that third group, Achieve.
Okay.
Who were all to work on these national standards. And
Gotcha.
so they're funded. And what you also need to understand, we keep hearing that this is state-led, it's voluntary, it's that we can't. This is not federal intrusion. But the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers, who hold the copyright to the standards, receive 40% of their funding from the federal government.
Here's the interesting thing, based on what I've been reading on this. It is saying here that Common Core standards are not a federal mandate. Rather, states could voluntarily adopt the English and math standards if they wanted. 45 states in the D.C. have adopted both, so that's 46. While Minnesota has adopted only the English standards, several states are holdouts. Alaska, right. Texas, Virginia, and Nebraska. Some states, such as Indiana and Massachusetts, have recently slowed down some aspects of the implementation. What first thing that concerns you when I read some information on this is that the Common Core standards are being backed by many corporations. Now, whenever corporations show so much enthusiasm for something, that's a bit of a red flag for me. And you want to know where the teaching is being spun, in other words. So is that similar information that you've gotten?
It is indeed. What we see, really, Al, is a conflict of worldviews. It's a clash of worldviews as far as who really knows best what our children need. And so on one side, you have big corporations, big business, big philanthropy, but I would call them venture philanthropy, and big government, and education elites that really kind of see children as a commodity, that see our students as an entity that needs to be managed. We see even students being referred to in some writings as human capital. I'm reading an article. I'm going to pull it real quickly. I have a quote here. The business community is by far the biggest consumer of the product created by our education system. I would submit to you that very few parents think of their children as a product. And so it's this clash of vision for who knows best. Is it all those big entities who have an agenda and who have not necessarily the same purposes that parents do? And here at Florida Family Policy Council, that's really our issue, is that parents ultimately have the responsibility for their children's education. That has long been understood in this nation. And by the adoption of Common Core, we are stripping parents of their authority over their child's education. We have lost local control by adopting these national standards that are controlled by outside organizations.
Reagan, I want to bring something up in that regard. I've long seen over the past few generations, parents are not taking the mantle, many of them. Yeah. Not you, and not including you and others like yourself, but to lead their children. And Reagan, of course, teaches college when he's not doing Florida Roundtable. And he's seen the product of the current system. And Reagan, your comments on the product of the current system?
Putting myself in great peril here. Yeah, it's. Let me put it to you this way. I was at a family reunion over in the Tampa Bay area, and my nephew's wife had a sorority sister who was a high school teacher in Ocala. And when she found out I was a college professor, the first thing she said to me was, "Let me apologize to you for the poor quality of students that we send on to the university system these days." English, wow. When you teach a Gordon Rule class, a part of the deal is that you're supposed to prove to the professor you have a command of written English. And that's pretty tough for an awful lot of the kids. Yeah.
Yes. Well, and I would submit to you that these standards do nothing to move us closer to the goal of really having proficiency in the English language. We've had several experts. I'm sure you've read some of this in doing your research, but the standards were actually not written by folks with classroom experience. And, in fact, they've been very bold and kind of flippant about the fact that they didn't have a lot of experience. And when we look at who the standards writers were, they were largely products of the test development companies, which makes sense from that perspective. If that's what you're about, is producing a product that can be tested easily, then it makes sense to have College Board and ACT employees writing your standards. But after the standards were written, kind of a gold seal committee was established. They were called the Validation Committee, and there were 25 members of that committee that were asked to come in and kind of put their good housekeeping seal of approval on the standards. And these were well-recognized, credentialed folks from across the United States. And 5 of them have refused to sign off on the standards. 2 have been very vocal about their opposition and are now, they were asked to sign a confidentiality agreement and not to speak about their objections to the standards, but they are now speaking, and they've been testifying in legislatures across the country about the deficiencies in both the English language arts and the math standards. And Dr. Sandra Stotsky is the expert in the English language arts standards, and she's responsible for some of the best in the world, the Massachusetts standards. And what she has said is that by the the 8th grade level, I believe it is, that students will be 2 years behind their peers based on the current standards. She has a comprehensive analysis of all of the deficiencies that she sees in English language arts, but she's very disturbed.
Well, and I don't think it's necessarily the teacher's fault. You have teachers in these schools for many, many years, but you're not getting parental support in the initial stages of development of children. And, you know, they're not getting the necessary building blocks. The parents aren't engaging them when they're young, and if you don't engage child's brains when they're young, then they're not going to develop properly. So there's always going to be a lag. You can give them Common Core up the yin-yang, but I don't really think, unless you start with the parents, of course, that's an individual thing, right? In other words, you don't need a license to have kids. Anybody can do it. But it takes a certain amount of skills to be a good parent, obviously. And if it's not being led in the parents' arena, which I'm not seeing information that it is in some cases, and Reagan's seeing it on his end, then you can have all these different standardized tests and Common Core and No Child Left Behind, but there's still going to be children left behind, right? And No Child Left Behind flopped anyway. Agreed.
And Al, I mean, parent involvement is absolutely crucial. What I am seeing today is it's a real wake-up call for parents, and Common Core, I think, has served a purpose for us in that it kind of heated, you know, the analogy of the frog in the warming water, and the frog just kind of stays in the warming water, and suddenly the water boils, and the frog is dead. Well, I think that the water got heated up a little too fast, and the frog, the parents, paid attention. They're waking up. And so this Common Core issue is really serving as an opportunity for them to reclaim authority over their children's education. And folks are shocked when I've traveled all over the state of Florida giving presentations on Common Core, really trying to present the facts. And when they begin to see what's happening in their child's classrooms, they're appalled. And I get emails and Facebook notices weekly of folks pulling children out of public school to take up other options. So I'm encouraged by the fact that parents are waking up, but I do think they've been conditioned over the years. I think all of us have been conditioned that this is what we do, that we raise our child to age 4, we put them on the little yellow school bus, and we trust that the government school is going to do what it's supposed to do. And it's not what it used to be. So we need to be aware of that. We need to be very involved in what's happening in our children's classrooms. And parents tell me regularly that they're really not encouraged to be involved in their children's classrooms.
I'd like to follow that line up about the teaching in the public schools versus other options in a moment.
Mm-hmm.
Tell you what, Laurel, we're going to take a pause along the network line here. Let us remind folks that they are listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day, Laura Caruso. Our topic, Common Core. And we'll continue the conversation following these messages. From Pensacola to Key West and all points in between, you are listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and in the Orlando area on Tough TV. I'm Reagan Smith.
You sound very smooth today, Reagan.
Well, I've got this congestion that has kind of settled into my throat and chest, Al. And
you know what they say, by the way, I'm Al Spry. The radio guys, we love to get colds because we sound, sexier on the air.
Well, well, thank you. I hadn't thought of it that way. I'm sitting here thinking, break my arm, break my leg, but leave my throat alone, please. So.
Laura Caruso, welcome back to Florida Roundtable.
Thanks. Great to be with you.
Yeah. Wanted to follow up on a line. Now, I'm going to play devil's advocate here, okay? People are denigrating public schools for a while, and I have an issue with that. Here's why. You're coming up with voucher programs and teaching at home. There's nothing wrong with these options as long as you're teaching kids competitively, because we live in a world economy and things have to be taught in a competitive way. And my only thing is with the voucher programs. I wanted to get your take on this. We'll slightly shift from Common Core for a moment. With the voucher programs, I think you're basically creating a two-class system. You see what I mean? The rich kids get the vouchers. The poorer kids stay in the public schools, ultimately. And then there's two classes of teaching. That's one issue that I have with it. Second issue is homeschool is fine to a certain degree. But what happens if the parent-teacher, who's the parent is the teacher, is teaching stuff that's not in line with educational core? How should I put it? What the child should be learning at that time. So those are the two things I have. I wanted to get your comments on each of those.
Well, and Al, I am not an expert on the voucher program, and so I hate to venture into those waters. My understanding of the vouchers is that they actually are to service those who, as you mentioned, poor kids. I mean, that they are supposed to provide services for folks that might not otherwise have access to private education. So that's certainly my understanding. What we see that is harmful is that Senator Gates has actually proposed that if there will be an expansion of the voucher program, whatever you think of that, if there is an expansion of the voucher program, which is under consideration in our legislature right now, that he would like to change the language in that bill to require any private school students that are receiving voucher money to be tied to the state test. The problem that we have with that is that then it's this nationalized test that measures the Common Core national standards. And so you are then de facto placing all private schools that accept voucher students under Common Core standards, Common Core tests. They're not going to teach one thing to one set of students and one thing to another. So they'll be de facto Common Core schools, really eliminating the idea of the free market, and the private schools have traditionally done better because there's competition there within the private. They're really held to a higher standard because they have to compete with one another for the students that are out there. As to home education, again, I think as a society, we've got to step back and say, who is responsible for the education of children? And I refer back, I'm a history buff, and I teach American history and lead these history tours, and so I refer back often to those primary documents. If we want to understand the foundations of our nation, we can look back and see, what did our founders say? And in the 1828 American Dictionary of the English Language, it's the first American dictionary of the English language we had, and of course Noah Webster provided us with that. And Webster knew the founders. He was friends with George Washington. He knew Patrick Henry, was present when the Constitutional Convention was meeting in Philadelphia. So we can look at his dictionary, and if we want to understand things about the government, read the definition of government. Very, very enlightening. But when we look at the definition of educate in that Webster's 1828 dictionary, the last part tells us to educate children well is one of the most important duties, not of the civil government. He says it's the most important duty of parents and guardians. So ultimately, again, parents have responsibility. Now, they can choose to delegate the process of education, which many do, to private schools and public schools. And we have a growing number of home educators in our state, but we still have primarily privately and publicly educated students. But again, ultimately, who is going to give an answer for the education of their children? Parents. And so parents must have authority. We can't ask parents to have responsibility for something over which they have no authority.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're a history buff, because Reagan and I both are history guys. I have a degree in American history, and Reagan teaches history. He has a master's. Yeah. I have a bachelor's, and he has a master's. So we like history. We always know the fact that history repeats itself. I'm going to give you it's a paraphrase quote The late George Carlin. I'm sure you know who that is.
I do.
Famous comedian and social commentator. He basically said, when in his last tour before he croaked, he said this. He said that the system wants to educate kids well enough to run the machines, but not well enough to critically think about past running the machines or to question authority. So when Common Core came out and this issue came out, I looked at this because he said that back in, I think it was 2009. I'm like, oh, George was right. Now, George wouldn't in any way, shape, or form be considered a conservative, a neocon. I think George Carlin was more a classic conservative, which would be akin to a liberal, which was the founding fathers were classic conservatives. They weren't. There's a difference between classic conservatism and neoconservatism, but won't go into that right now. So let's just say that I think George was right, and I wanted to see what you thought.
I agree. I think the goal of the Common Core standards, and you can see the fingerprints. We look at big government and big corporations. Just simply look at who is funding this. We have a huge, there's going to be a campaign launched today to publicize and promote the adoption of Common Core because there's been such a public outcry. As families have realized what this really is, as this stuff has started to come home in backpacks and show up on kitchen tables, parents are alarmed. They see the problems. They see the confusion that is reigning, and it's not because they're more rigorous. And so you're going to hear that, oh, they're more rigorous. It's going to take our students a while to adapt. They're not more rigorous. They, in fact, breed confusion. For the math standards, the English standards, there are lots of flaws. They're developmentally inappropriate. And so I would agree that one of the agendas is indeed to train children only well enough so that they can perform the tasks that most benefit those corporations that are pushing it. Again, that quote that I read to you earlier, the business community is by far the biggest consumer of the product created by our education system.
And you know, Reagan, to follow up on that, Thomas Jefferson spoke out against corporations in his letters and so forth. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
He was not a pro-corporate guy. I think we've tied corporations in too much with the ideas of, and you know, obviously, you have a bit too much influence, I think, in governmental affairs and governmental policy by corporations. We had a gentleman on a few months ago talking about that. Crony capitalism, also known as soft fascism. There's a couple different words for it. But I think that the implementation of stuff like this, because when you got to always look at who's behind it, whenever you look at anything, I think, you know, whenever you look at any policy promotion or anything that's coming through in a policy way, you have to look at who's sponsoring this and what is the aim of whoever's sponsoring this.
Yeah.
And so
let me ask you this, Laura, now. How does Common Core interface or replace or what? I can hear folks saying, I'm confused. I thought we had FCATs and all that kind of stuff, that the state of Florida has these things in place. How does all this fit together?
That's a great question, Reagan. When we adopted the Common Core state standards, we checked a box when we were competing for some grant money that the federal government had held out there. So that's initially what brought the Common Core to Florida. And our former Governor Charlie Crist and then Commissioner of Education Eric Smith are the ones that signed on the dotted line, accepted the federal grant money, and obligated us to those national standards that are controlled in Washington, D.C. Those standards, when we adopt them, I mean, the whole point is that they're national standards that would be the same. And so the only freedom that was given legally was that a state could add 15% to the standards. So when we adopted the Common Core, we discarded our next generation Sunshine State standards in both math and English language arts and replaced them with the Common Core package, the Common Core standards. After much public outcry in recent months, the governor issued an executive order, and essentially it said many nice things and didn't do a lot. But one of the things that he did was he asked for public hearings across the state. 3 of them were held, and the point was to ask for, you know, what did the public think about changes to the standards. And we said at the time that there couldn't be changes to the standards, no meaningful changes, because that's the point. They have to be uniform across the states. So as a result of the more than 19,000 public comments that were received, and I want to mention that's a record. The governor's office has confirmed we've never had that much response to standards ever in the history of the state of Florida. When the standards were released, they allowed 2 months of public comment. Nobody knew about it. They simply posted the standards on flstandards.org, and that was it. There were no big press releases, no conferences, no parent-teacher meeting, nothing like that to say, hey, we're starting something new. This is going to be a big shift. We want your input. And they literally got 433 comments in 2 months.
That's because they didn't want people's input. When you're trying to push something through, you only want to put window dressing up. You don't want to actually get the comments.
Parents should be outraged at this. And the other thing they should be outraged about is after receiving the comments, our State Board of Education literally found minimal things that they could kind of sprinkle on top that amounted to a 0.8% adaptation of the standards. So we have 99.2% the same standards as everybody else. And at that same meeting where they adopted these quote-unquote changes that were essentially copy edits, I wish I had time to talk you through some of these changes, meaningless little phrases and the addition of some calculus standards and 4 cursive standards. That's it. So they adopt this on top of the 11,000 standards that we had. And at that same meeting, they dared to change the name. Because Common Core, that phrase, has become kind of toxic politically, they changed the name to the Florida Standards. And so now we actually have in print from some of our politicians statements from their offices saying, we are no longer doing the Common Core. We were moving that direction last year, but this year we're doing something different. There's legislation introduced to actually scrub the phrase Common Core from any state statute where it exists. And that is appalling to me. Again, it's just the effort to keep parents and citizens out of the process and in the dark.
Yeah. On that note, we need to pause again along our network line. Laura, let us remind folks that they're listening to the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest is Laura Caruso. We are discussing Common Core, and if you'll stay put, our conversation continues following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area of Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry. It's great to be back on Florida Roundtable, except that some people are, they're starting to get wind of Florida Roundtable. I think we need to change the name to Two Handsome Smart Guys on the Radio. I think we're going to call it that. And then we'll throw people off a little bit,
I like that.
Just like the Florida legislature is doing with Common Core.
That's right, absolutely. Rebrand.
Our special guest this day is Laura Caruso, and we have been talking about Common Core. And Laura, I guess one of the most important things we can do is give you the opportunity to tell folks along our network line where they can find more information and how they can get involved with this.
Absolutely. The first place that I would direct parents is stopcommoncoreflorida.com. It's all spelled out, stopcommoncoreflorida.com. And when you go to that site, it's a landing page that has resources for you, and it also has a place to contact legislators. Kind of a one-stop shopping. You literally if you want to, put in your address information. It populates the letter for you, and you can send a letter of concern to your legislators, and you have the opportunity to customize that letter if you'd like. And the other place I would recommend is my organization's website, flfamily.org. And if you go to that website and sign up for our legislative updates, you'll be receiving information on the progress of Stop Common Core legislation, which leads me to the fact that we do have 2 bills that are submitted and are in committees. The leadership would prefer that these bills never make it out of committee and not be heard, and that's really unacceptable as well. It's been because of the outcry of parents across the state that we have these 2 bills. It's House Bill 25, sponsored by Debbie Mayfield, and Senate Bill 1316, sponsored by Senator Greg Evers of Pensacola. We need folks to let their legislators know that those bills need co-sponsors, and those bills must be given a fair hearing.
Well, let me ask you this before you go. Instead of this Common Core, what do you think legislatures should do in order to raise these standards? Obviously, and graduate kids who really are are at the level to compete in this world market. What alternative do you propose, or what alternative do you see that's viable?
Well, it's interesting. The math standards and the English language arts standards that we had prior to the adoption of those national Washington, D.C. based Common Core standards, our Florida standards were higher, and we abandoned them. So I also see that the standards may not be the ultimate answer to anything. We can have very high standards, but if students aren't reaching those standards, it doesn't matter, have we changed the bar? Mm-hmm. We have to help them. We have to find new strategies for really helping students reach that bar.
What do you think the best strategy would be before you go, in your mind?
Well, ultimately, it is more parent involvement. Ultimately, it has to be the reclaiming of parental authority. And you asked me earlier about home education.
Yeah.
And I would say that has been largely, the success of the home education movement, when we look at test scores and performance overall, it's light years away from what we see across the board in public and even private schools. And I just see there's a direct correlation between parent involvement, because that's what it was designed to be.
So you think an education campaign to get parents more involved, perhaps, or something like that?
Absolutely.
All right, well, on that...
A buy-in from parents.
And Laura, I was going to say, real quickly, give us those websites again.
Absolutely. The first is www.stopcommoncoreflorida.com, and the other is flfamily.org.
Laura Caruso, thank you so much for being with us this day. You have provided an eye-opener on Common Core and what is going on in the educational system. And we can't stress it strongly enough. Parents, pay attention and take an interest. Don't blindly trust to your educational system. Make it your business to know what your children are learning. And Laura, we hope you'll come back and do this again sometime.
Absolutely. I echo your comments, Reagan. That was well said.
I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
And we'll be back with a closing thought following these messages. We are back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
And a pleasure to have Laura Caruso with us, a very, very knowledgeable lady in the field of education and education testing.
Absolutely, and of course, George Carlin's chalk another one up for the late George Carlin.
There you go.
He was on point with that.
Yeah.
Here's campaign. Of course, politicians getting petty in campaign year. They always do. Florida Democrats file a complaint after Scott campaign shifts money. The head of the Florida Democratic Party is contending that Republican Governor Rick Scott's campaign broke state campaign finance laws by shifting money between accounts. Election law complaints can be routine during an election year. Of course, they like to bitch during an election year. But this one could be significant. If confirmed, it could result in a fine as much as $82 million, Reagan.
Whoa.
Allison Tant, who's the chairwoman of the state party, filed the complaint with the Florida Elections Commission, naming Scott and his political committee Let's Get to Work. The complaint maintains that the campaign broke the law when Scott transferred nearly $27 million from one type of campaign account to another earlier this month. They violated the law, and the governor's supposed to uphold the law, is the quote from Tant to the Associated Press.
Yes.
John French, of course, says last week the movement of funds was legal.
Yeah.
Well, what's he going to say? It's illegal? Scott first set up the Let's Get to Work back in 2010 as a way to help out his campaign for governor when he was challenging a Republican who had the backing of many GOP leaders. So we'll see how that one all plays out. No comment here either way. Just kind of an interesting story.
Yeah, it's out there. You notice that the Scott campaign has started the television advertising.
Is his mom back?
Yes. And what a hard youth he had, and how hard she worked, and
she worked so well for him last time. So I figured Mom would be back.
It is, but this has got to be one of the earliest starts.
And then briefly, to pertain to what we were talking about earlier, Republican lawmakers are seeking to expand charter schools and voucher programs. Representative Manny Diaz, a highly Republican, said school choice is a priority. Well, you know how I feel about that. I think we need equality in education, Reagan. Just bring everybody up instead of having a tiered system.
There you go. Well, it is about time for us to run up the white flag. We'll call this a show for this week. We thank you for the pleasure of your company. We invite your comments, as always, and suggestions. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
We'll see you again in another week with another edition of the Florida Roundtable.
You've been listening to Florida Roundtable, a weekly look at issues and problems of concern to Floridians from a state, national, and international perspective. Presented by the Florida News Network with your hosts, Reagan Smith and Al Spry. The views and opinions expressed during the preceding program are solely those of the participants and not necessarily those of this station's ownership, management, or sponsors of FNN. Your views and opinions are welcome. Address your card or letter to Florida Roundtable in care of Reagan Smith, 2500 Maitland Center Parkway, Suite 407, Maitland, Florida, 32751. Or you may email reagansmith@fnnonline.com. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week for another edition of Florida Roundtable.